What is up, everybody, and welcome back to another daily drop brought to you by TarHeelIllustrated.com. I'm THI staff writer Jacob Turner. Joining me as he always does, it's our very own publisher, Andrew Jones. And AJ, I'm excited about this topic. And this is, I guess these are almost, we're doing one podcast here around basketball. We're going to do the same thing for football as well. So these kind of come in a pair, but I'm really excited to talk about this one. And as you guys know, if you've clicked on this video, we're going to be talking about what the loudest we've ever heard the Dean Dome has been. So specific games that stand out. Obviously, AJ, you've been you've covered more games, a heck of a lot more games in the Dean Dome than I have in my short career here at TarHeelIllustrated.com, and even going back further than that in your previous jobs working in sports journalism. So I know I'm interested to hear your takes. As some of mine are, I guess, going to be a little bit more recency to them, just because I've been in more games in the Smith Center the last 5 years than before that. So I'll kick it to you quickly and ask you the question. Give me some of your loudest games in the Smith Center, and then I want you to pick one, AJ, if you had to pick one that stands out as your number one. But let's go back in memory lane a little bit. Take me to some of your loudest moments in the Smith Center.
The loudest I've ever heard it was when Marvin Williams had the putback to beat Duke in 2005.
I think that's like the consensus amongst Carolina fans. I think people know that. I think that's number one. Yeah.
Yeah, like that's the retired jersey of loudness at the
Let me ask you this, AJ, because I've been at Carolina Duke games in the Smith Center. They've been pretty loud. One of mine is my loudest is going to be a Carolina Duke game. What made that one? I know it was the putback, but what made that one so much different? Was it just deafeningly loud? Was it shaking in there? Like, what made it different?
Yeah, it was. I think that the emotion poured into the volume, because some of the stuff that we've talked about in previous daily drops, with 2002 being a colossal disaster, and the Guthridge years, even though we went to two Final Fours, you could see things were sliding. The Doherty years, post-Dean, and people were terrified that Carolina wasn't going to get it back. And then they go in, they lost at Duke earlier in that year, and they were still, Duke was the hierarchy, and Carolina was still trying to claw its way back, which was an unfamiliar position for North Carolina basketball.
Was that the Felton game, AJ? Sorry, in Durham, where they didn't take the last shot, they never got a shot off or something like that.
There was the loose ball, and I think JJ got the loose ball and slid. And by the way, that was right in front of Donald and Melania Trump, by the way. I don't think they were married yet, but that was right in front of Donald Trump over on that baseline. That was wild, because it's always amazing how many people you see on the baseline for Duke Carolina games, but in Cameron especially. But it was, I think that Carolina fans so desperately wanted to get back to where they were, but they had to beat Duke to take that next step. And when Marvin put that shot in, it was like all of the emotion from post-Dean up to that moment. And I think some inferiority complex that settled into some of the fan base, which had never had existed before. The fear, absolutely, that they would never, ever be what they once were. And I think people are still concerned about Roy, because at that time, Roy had the moniker that he couldn't win the big one, because he lost the title game in '91 at Kansas. He lost 2 years earlier to Syracuse, when Kansas shot like 45% from the free throw line, and a couple of freshmen, big-time freshmen for Syracuse, beat them. So I think people weren't totally yet sold on Roy. And that shot went through, they won the game, and everything just poured out. And you could feel it pouring out. It wasn't just a loud moment. When it settled, the buzz settled higher than I've ever felt a buzz settle. The only comparison in any event that I could give to that, in any event that I've covered, was the final 10 seconds countdown when the Hurricanes won the Stanley Cup in 2006.
I know that had to be loud.
Game 7 against the Edmonton Oilers. I covered that as well. That was piercing. But it was sort of a buildup, because you saw it coming. With Marvin's, it was instant reaction. So it was, oh my goodness. And then boom. Oh, yes. I mean, you could just feel the arena flooded with the emotion and the exhilaration, and suddenly the optimism and confidence that North Carolina was back, and then they won a national championship a month later. So that would be number one for me. But there are some other fantastic moments that we could discuss, but you got to give me yours before we hash a bunch of other ones out.
Yeah, my loudest one, and again, I have a little bit smaller of a sample size because I haven't been to nearly as many games in the Smith Center as you've been. I've been to a lot over the last 5 years, but mine is the loudest. Would go back to the Duke game in 2019. I believe it was on March 9th, I think is what it was, 2019 or something like that, when Carolina beat Duke by 9 points. Number one, Duke. It was 3-1 in that game. So this is, you're talking Cam Reddish, RJ Barrett, Trey Jones on Duke. You're talking Kenny Williams, Luke May, Kobe White, Cam Johnson, Team Nazir Little. That to me is the loudest I've heard the Smith Center. And we were talking about this off camera, AJ, but I think we're all in a consensus that it almost has to be a Duke game. We've talked about this because there's nothing quite like it. Like the buzz around a Duke game, just the Duke games on average in the Smith Center are just so much louder. Even at every moment, every shot matters. You can tell. And if people who've been to a Carolina Duke game in the Smith Center, you know exactly what I'm talking about versus playing, I know Virginia games can get loud, but even in Virginia, it doesn't quite compare to it. It can Virginia. We've had some games over the past few years in the Smith Center against Virginia that have been very loud that we could talk about later in the podcast, but nothing quite compares to Duke. And for me, that game is the loudest I've been. I can't remember exactly what happened in that game, but I know Kenny Williams, I think, hit some big shots in that game.
It's a big shot late. Yeah,
I can see
Kobe.
Jenna Miller, our former photographer, shout out Jenna. I can see her photos of Kenny celebrating in my head because I've seen him so many times looking through it.
Well, that was just a highly emotional game for that team. That was an emotional team. And that team had some pretty dynamic personalities, very different personalities, but it blended well together. And Zion didn't play in the first two games. Well, he did play in the first one. That's when
blew a shoe out,
up. And then Luke dominated in Cameron. And then they go to Chapel Hill. So, it secured a regular season sweep against that team. They actually played an epic game a week later in Charlotte.
Yeah, that was a great game, too. That's one of the best games I've ever watched.
The two best ACC tournament semifinal games I've ever covered was that one, and then the Maryland Duke one in 2001 in Atlanta. The Nate James tip-in, that was an unbelievable game with an incredible atmosphere. The one in Charlotte, I think, was even better atmosphere.
That was great.
That was the Cam Johnson breakaway dunk after a Duke-made basket, which is a part of Carolina basketball that has disappeared the last couple of years that probably could use a return. But anyway, we're not going there right now. The 19 one, Kenny with that shot and the smile on his face. That was that's something that I'll remember from that one. That was very, very, very loud. Gonzaga, the same season.
Yeah, Gonzaga's a great shout. I was at that game.
That was huge. Because that was a really important game for that group. And that sequence in the first half when Seventh Woods just played out of skin. He climbed out of his skin and was a different guy for 8 minutes. He had 14 points that game. And his scoring caused Mark Few to call timeout. And when Carolina came to the bench, I mean, the look on Seventh's face is like, okay, this is a first and a last, unfortunately for him. But he was the dude. He was the man that moment, and the place was on fire. That was a great moment. It was very loud. The Marcus Page shot against Louisville, that scoop shot, basically to beat Louisville, in a night that Pitino was mouthing off and drawing the angst of the crowd. Pitino got the crowd going a lot. That helped. That raised the baseline atmosphere there, and it peaked when Marcus hit that shot. So there are certainly quite a few non-Duke moments, but you're right. The Duke moments, they start from a higher place. The baseline buzz for a Duke game is right here, when the baseline buzz for other important games is like right here. And that's still a pretty good level, but it's just off the charts. There's nothing that compares to the Duke games.
No, it really doesn't. And that's why I think it has to be. For me, that's my loudest. And like I talked about, I think I can't remember what year has been. There's been a couple games in the Smith Center against UVA in recent years that have get pretty loud. There's even some moments against State, especially when you look at how some of the blowouts Carolina have had. I would say some of the State games, one thing I'll say about that, because they've blown them out so many times at Smith Center, weirdly enough, in recent years. That's almost like the most party atmosphere I've ever seen. Because a lot of these games, like, keep this in mind too, a lot of these games, for whatever reason that I've been to when they've blown out State Smith Center, are like these noon tip-offs or like 1 p.m., 2 p.m. tip-offs. There's usually some kind of big posse of football recruits there as well, football coaches there as well. And just some of the most memorable games I have in just terms of the Smith Center and what the environment was like, and just the fun kind of party, happy-go-lucky atmosphere have been those games, because not only are you blowing out a team that, Carolina fans for the most part just despise in NC State, but the way those games go down and how easy they end up being just makes it such a very interesting and loud environment. Doesn't compare to Duke in terms of sheer loudness, but those games are, when I look back and over the last 4 or 5 years of covering games in the Smith Centers, those are always games that stand out for me as well, just because of it's a different atmosphere than I've maybe seen against some other opponents. And I'm sure if they ever beat Duke by 30 in the Smith Center, which would probably never happen, it would make it even better than that. I think being in the Smith Center the COVID year when they just wore Duke out would have been fascinating to see what that atmosphere would have been like, because of how easy that game was for North Carolina. But unfortunately, we don't get to see that. Any other games that stand out, maybe going back a little bit further?
Yeah. As you're talking, I'm racking my brain. I'm going to try to pick some non-conference games. Arizona in 2006 was a big one. Bobby Frazier played really, really well that game. He was a freshman point guard. That was the year after the title, Hansborough. And that was really good Arizona team that came in. UConn came in a couple years earlier. I'm trying to think if it was a McCants shot at McCants or a Jawad Williams shot against them. The place was very, very loud. It was a great, great atmosphere. When Maryland came in for the ACC Big Ten Challenge after Maryland had left the league several years after they left, that was a highly anticipated game. And I don't know if there was a moment where there was a decibel like some of the ones we've discussed, but the pregame buzz for that was probably about as good as I've seen for any non-conference game, maybe ever, that I've covered, in part because it was Maryland. They were back, and there was always sort of a dislike between Maryland and Carolina anyway, especially for the Maryland side. There was a lot of NC State in the Maryland fan base, and I think they were even more vitriolic toward the Carolina and Duke. I've said before that Carolina and Duke playing at Maryland were my favorite games to cover for years, like when I was with Fox, and I'd go up there and cover those games until Maryland left, obviously. But that was a great atmosphere building up to that game, and it was just spot on throughout. The fans were into every whistle, every shot, every pass. They were really into that game. As far as ACC goes, you mentioned UVA. I think once UVA got really good, they had a stretch there where they beat Notre Dame, I think, in 16 or 17 when Notre Dame had Connaughton and all those dudes. It was a great atmosphere. And then they beat UVA at home. It was an incredible atmosphere because I think UVA had already sort of flexed its muscles against Carolina. So there are a lot of games, but clearly we could do a pod just on the Duke ones. And I hope that every Carolina fan that watches this, listens to this, has a chance to go experience one Carolina Duke game at Chapel Hill, because it's a totally different buzz. If you get to do it in Cameron too, it's great. I kind of prefer it in Cameron from an atmosphere standpoint, just because I've covered a ton of games there and it gets so loud, but you could be in there for Duke against anybody else and think, man, this is as loud as this building can get.
It's a high school gym. It's easy, a little bit
easy. And then you bring Carolina in a few days later and you're like, wow, I didn't know it could get this loud.
Yeah.
And Chapel Hill's the same way. It's just a different buzz. It's a different experience.
It's hard to explain if you haven't been there. Yeah.
I've done 59 or 60 Duke Carolina games.
It's very hard to explain.
I would say as far as peak noise, of my top 15, I bet you 10 of them or 12 of them are Duke Carolina.
And I don't know if anything will ever surpass the 05 Marvin Williams.
I guess I could say when the shot that Villanova hit to beat Carolina in the title game, that was wild, but it was so cavernous, it was so big that it almost took a while for the noise to reach you.
Yeah. Because it's in a football stadium, yeah.
Yeah, that was wild. We'll talk about like really neat experiences too. That one was pretty wild, walking through the Villanova fans, and I don't want to share the experience here now, but that'll
be a good daily drop to do. Yeah,
that locker room afterward, which we still have the videos on our YouTube channel. You should go watch it. It's pretty wild. It's the most emotional I've ever seen players.
Can only imagine. You guys, let us know what your loudest game is in the Smith Center. Especially if you've been going for a long time. I think it'd be really interested to hear from a guy who's maybe been a season ticket holder for 40, 30 years or something like that. Been to a ton of games and experience. Because 05, I think, is always the consensus It's always the one that people talk about with the Marvin Williams putback. I think you've even asked some coaches, and Roy, who's part of that game, he might tell you that that's the loudest he's ever seen the Smiths. And I know I've heard certain people who've been covering Carolina for a long time said the same thing. So let us know what yours is. Get involved at our on Twitter. You can get involved in the conversation at Heel Illustrated, Facebook page at Tar Heel Illustrated, and our website, of course, TarHeelIllustrated.com. Get involved on the premium message boards. You'll find the thread for this video over there. If you're a premium subscriber, you can sign up for just $8.33 a month. If you are not, plenty of more daily drops coming this offseason, AJ. So make sure you guys stay tuned for all of those. Make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell too, so you know every single time that we upload. And if you're enjoying these daily drops, hit the like button below. Let's see how many likes we can get on this video. We appreciate you watching. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks.